So I'm going to just get to my main choice of what I'm going to argue as the negative case for what we're talking about here, the reasonableness of the Christian faith. And I want you to think about a fact that I read about on the plane here. I was reading an article about a particular charity group that's working on a particular problem these days, and it was a quite alarming statistic that this charity was working with, and that's the fact that every 21 seconds, somewhere on Earth, a child dies from contaminated water. That means by the end of my opening statement, over 50 children will have died of diseases contracted from their local water supply. Now start counting off the deaths in your head. It's pretty horrific. This is one of thousands of examples of fundamental injustice in the structure and design of the world that I could mention. But to keep it simple, I'll just use this one in particular because it is especially relevant to Christianity. In the time of Jesus, half of all children died before adulthood from diseases. I want you to imagine that. Imagine that now, more than half of all children born, all children you know, your own children, never survive to be adults. Most die miserably. And imagine that's just the way things are, and yet it's totally preventable. I want you to think about that for a moment while I fix my computer. Not only could someone who had the ability to eradicate all diseases just get rid of the problem altogether, right immediately, but even just knowing the germ theory of disease and how to decontaminate water, food, and milk, and sterilize instruments and utensils, and maintain community sanitation, even that can reduce the frequency of child death from half of all children to less than 1 in 1,000, like in America today. Now imagine that now that half of all the children you know are dying, but we could make that 1 in 1,000. Now, did Jesus do that for us? Did he or his God tell us about germs or parasites or how to create a less diseased world? No. Humans had to figure it out on their own after thousands of years of misery, and then they had to do it themselves. Jesus never mentioned anything about how to create this better world that we made, nor did any Christian get the message for almost 2,000 years of ruling half the world. And when they did get it, it didn't come from Jesus or God. It came from guesswork and experiment. It came from science. In the Gospels, the Jews come to Jesus and complain that his disciples don't wash their hands before they eat, like everyone else was doing. In fact, everyone else was washing their cooking utensils as well. We now know that that's a pretty good idea, and we know why. It reduced infection. So did Jesus say, hey, you're right. In fact, you should do that even more diligently because it will kill the germs that kill you and all your children? No. Jesus argued that we don't have to wash our hands before we eat, that washing is a human tradition with no endorsement from God, and that nothing we put into us can harm us. And as he is claimed to have said in the Gospel of Mark, not even poison. Clearly, Jesus knew nothing about germs, nor did he know that faith doesn't make you immune to poison either. Notably, nowhere in the New Testament does Jesus or God ever impart any correct knowledge or information about the world that wasn't already known to men of the time. Thus, apparently, Jesus and his God were as ignorant as every other first-century human. So Jesus said nothing about the existence of germs and what to do about them. He thus failed to save the lives of millions upon millions of innocent children. He and his God just let them die miserably for thousands and thousands of years, because remember, humanity's been around for a lot longer than Jesus has. Jesus also didn't say anything about parasites, waterborne or animal-borne. Most curiously, the Gospels only have Jesus perform occasional faith healings on people with no actual verifiable diseases. Similar faith healing acts are performed in all religions today, yet they never cure any verifiable disease like malaria or influenza. Anecdotes aside, we've never scientifically confirmed this. Much less did they restore lost organs or limbs. Jesus also never cured any verifiable disease, nor ever restored any lost organ or limb. Jesus thus had no more power than any other random faith healer from any other religion today. Not just Christians can do faith healing, Muslims and other practitioners of other religions can. Pagans did as well. Now let's compare that with what an actual God could do. A God, or any man granted his power, could cure all sick people on the whole earth. Now imagine Jesus had done that. With just a thought, not just a few people he happened to bump into in one tiny corner of the world. In fact, an actual God, or any man granted his power, could simply eliminate all germs and parasites altogether, or render them all harmless to humans, or at least to children. But no, Jesus and his God didn't do anything godlike. Just as their knowledge was ignorantly human, so was their ability. In the time of Jesus, the top killers of millions of children and adults were malaria, typhoid, and tuberculosis. Pay close attention to the Gospels. Never once does Jesus ever meet a single person clearly afflicted with those ailments. And yet those are the most common ailments, most commonly killing people around him at the time. Once, according to the Gospels, he cured a fever, and that's it, just an ordinary fever. Yet hundreds of thousands were dying of those more serious illnesses all around him. Carefully avoiding them, Jesus never had to try to heal them. We know he couldn't, as no other human faith healer can either. Because faith healing isn't real. It's psychosomatic. If it worked, we'd have faith healing wings in all our hospitals. Malaria, killer of millions of children, even still today, shockingly, even after 2,000 years of Christianity, malaria is caused by parasites transmitted by mosquitoes, which breed in stagnant pools of water and can be warded off with chemicals and nets or just killed. At the very least, Jesus could have mentioned that. Hey, you should do something about those stagnant pools of water over here, and there's this thing called a mosquito net I want to tell you about. But no, Jesus didn't even know to do that, much less just eliminate the malaria parasite like any actual God would do. Typhoid and other lethal fevers are transmitted by a lack of public and personal sanitation, basic germ theory of disease. Jesus didn't mention that either or do anything about it. A leading cause of tuberculosis in children is contaminated milk. Ever wonder why we pasteurize our milk? Now you know. Did Jesus tell us that? No. You'd think a really nice thing to do would be to tell everyone that the milk they are drinking and the cheese they are eating is killing them and their kids, and that simply heating the milk up a bit would solve the problem, saving millions of lives and ending ages of misery. An actual God, or anyone in regular chat mode with him, would at least know to tell us how to fight these diseases: washing hands, sanitizing cooking utensils and medical instruments, mosquito nets and getting rid of standing water, heating milk before drinking it, or making cheese from it, basic stuff like that. But Jesus didn't even know that eating with unwashed hands is bad for you. Knowledge is not the only thing a real God would have that he can give us if he cared about us and existed. God would know the actual cure for every disease right now, every disease, cancer, everything. He could even just cure every disease right now. Now imagine if he were an ordinary person. We weren't talking about God, we were just talking about a Joe. Some guy who knew how to cure every disease on earth and could do it immediately at no expense to himself, yet didn't tell anyone or do anything. Would you think that person cared about us? I wouldn't. Let's take it seriously. Would you think it was reasonable to worship a guy like that, to think anything kind of him? That's not the example of a nice guy, not the sort of example of a guy you'd want to follow or have faith in. The Christian religion is simply not believable in the face of this evidence. Neither Jesus nor Christianity as a whole has exhibited any special source of information about the world, nothing distinctive of actual divine communication. They didn't know about germs, they didn't know about parasites. Christians have no more evidence of having a pipeline to a kind and all-knowing God than any other religion in history has, and that's the principal point here. The fact that it took Christians 1,800 years, do the math on that, 1,800 years, to figure out that germs and parasites even existed, and it might be a good idea to kill them before they kill our kids, proves that Christianity is a man-made religion and not something received from any real God. If you were a time traveler and got back to the first century, what would be one of the first things you told them? Why, about germs and parasites, of course, and how to combat them. It would be absolutely cruel not to withhold that information and watch over half of all children die miserably from preventable diseases for thousands of years. Thus, if Jesus were really God's emissary, he would have told us those things, as surely as any compassionate time traveler would, as surely as you would, had you the chance. If you are more informed about the world and more compassionate than Jesus and his God, then the Christian faith is simply not reasonable. It's just another false religion. Now, that's my main negative case, but now let me address some of the points that David Marshall brought up. Now, we're not here to debate whether some belief in God is reasonable or something supernatural exists. Maybe there's a God, maybe there's the supernatural. That's not relevant to this debate. We're here to discuss whether the Christian faith specifically is reasonable. Now, I already refute most of his arguments for a generic God and the generic supernatural in my other works, including The Christian Delusion and The End of Christianity. So if you want to see my whole case against those things, it's there. Here I'll just address what has been argued that is relevant to whether the Christian faith is reasonable. Now, he talks about the Gospels as evidence. The fact is, we don't know who wrote them or who their sources were. And they look just like other tales of gods and demigods, and we don't believe them. Centuries before Christianity, the goddess Inanna and the gods Romulus and Zalmoxis were preached as having died and been resurrected from the dead and communicating with their followers afterwards. Those who believed in Zalmoxis even received eternal life. Sound familiar? We don't believe these stories, so why would we believe the Christian version? You don't trust stories that have men walking on water and calming storms and conjuring food and blotting out the sun and having conversations with demons, so why would you trust this one? It's simply not reasonable to. It's just another mythical superhero story. Now, he didn't mention the epistles. And the epistles give us no evidence of any of these kinds of supernatural things that Jesus was doing. The only Jesus that's known there is in visions and spirit communications that the Christians were having. So we don't have any evidence here of anything special that distinguishes Christianity as more probably true than any other religious faith. Now, I want to give you another example. Is it reasonable to believe an alien spaceship was recovered at Roswell, New Mexico, and alien bodies in it were autopsied by the government? Books written within 40 years of the event in 1947 claim dozens of witnesses saw these things and gave detailed narratives of them. Yet we can look at the original evidence because it still survives and confirm it was just a weather balloon and some test equipment that was actually recovered, no spaceship, no alien autopsies. We don't have access to the original evidence in the case of Jesus. We only have the writings 40 years later of the hardcore believers. This is like having only the books of hardcore believers in the Roswell spaceship and alien autopsies. Yet it is not reasonable to believe them, so it is not reasonable to believe the Gospels. Books written 40 years later by fanatical believers just aren't reasonable evidence. We can't rely on them. We need the original evidence, or evidence we can directly confirm now. But we have no access to that anymore. We therefore cannot reasonably believe in Christianity based on its unverifiable faith literature. We need more reliable evidence than that, just as we would need more reliable evidence to believe in alien autopsies and spaceships. And let's talk about this thing about miracles. He gave several stories about lucky coincidences and people experiencing the supernatural. People of all religious faiths can make those claims. If he could actually present scientific evidence that only Christians had those kinds of experiences, that only Christians experienced supernatural aid, that only Christians experienced lucky coincidences, then he might have a case. But we don't have evidence of that. These things are experienced by everyone, and therefore they show no favor to one religion over another. To give you an example, he talks about an imam who heard a voice to say, "Follow Jesus." Now, if everyone got that voice, if everyone on earth heard a voice to follow Jesus, then you'd have a case. But instead, we're talking about a 1 in a billion example here. If something like that happens so rarely, it looks a lot more like random coincidence, random chance, or something that's not divine. If it happened to everybody, then you'd have a case that maybe there might be something special going on. And he talks about miracle stories. Just read the books of Joe Nickell. Joe Nickell has written many books about this. He actually investigates these miracle stories and finds that in reality, the evidence doesn't hold up. People's memories are often out of alignment with what actually happened, or the stories aren't true to begin with. So we can't really rely on these kinds of things. And you don't. Let's be honest here. You don't really trust these kinds of things. If I gave you a book that claimed that Gandhi flew through the sky with the devil, battled demons, cured the blind with magical mud, stopped hurricanes with a single command, cast spells that made dinner materialize out of thin air, levitated at will, transmutated substances with a gesture, and survived a month without eating a single morsel, would you believe that book? No, you would not. And you wouldn't make excuses for why you should believe it. You know it's bunk. You don't need to research it. And this would be the case especially when you asked me who wrote the book and I told you I wasn't sure. I don't really know. Even more especially when you asked where the mysterious author of this book learned of these things, and I told you he never really says. It is simply not really reasonable to believe books like this, and there is simply no way to honestly gainsay that fact. You would not trust such a book from any other religion, and yet the book I just described is the New Testament. The Gospels claim Jesus did all these things that I just mentioned there. It even narrates them. You wouldn't believe such a book about Gandhi. Why would you believe such a book about Jesus?